Mediopolis, a speculative work of fiction. 2100, a new technological age, where recording has become an advanced thing that permeates within society, is ubiquitous, all-encompassing, where many towns, cities, people, places have entered a new technological age of live streaming themselves. Whole towns, cities, villages, houses that are live streamed with cameras in lounges, bedrooms, in kitchens, gardens, hallways, all over in different parts of the house. Body cams, dash cams, cameras in cars, cameras in official buildings, street cameras, where many places and people are openly filmed in many more open places. Whole houses were born that were filmed 24/7, live streamed. Live streamed houses and even live streamed towns were slowly gradually born during the end of the 21st century, emerging into a new live streaming world, with live streaming cities, towns and villages that people moved to, if only for a few days or weeks or months at a time, for various experiments or therapy, or to learn. This was a new live streaming world, though it wasn't the whole world, of course. There were merely some people, some of the time, that subscribed to this new way of living, this new technological way of living, of filming oneself 24/7, or in all parts of the room, or in all rooms of the house, or in all houses of a whole city that could be filmed, with everyone with their own body cams, whether on their head or on their person, on their clothing, that they could wear it in a lapel perhaps, in all many different places, as well as the cameras that they already carried and filmed regularly down the streets, in places that they visited, parks, anywhere really. People carrying easy to use and easy to film footage. But it took a long time to edit and put together different things in a meaningful sense, to put together images in a coherent narrative that made sense as a story. Many families did edit their own highlights from the week, and people would spend some hours during the course of a month viewing each other as a way of learning about each other still. An indirect way, perhaps, where people could only learn from the different views that they were able to see of each other, the edited versions of each other's lives, perhaps. Albeit, there were many more things to learn through this still, even if they wouldn't know absolutely everything, and there were limitations that the technology brought with it. But also with those limitations, the technology also brought new abilities to make contact with people in distant places, to share our meaningful stories of how we're living in a city, in a town, in a house, how we're coping in a profession, with an illness, in a difficult relationship, with all number of things, to make recordings of those and regular ones and put them together in a coherent story to send to distant relatives as a way of sharing our own story with them, the highlights perhaps, and maybe even sometimes the lowlights too. Such camera footage couldn't always be relied upon as absolute, genuine, or always true, perhaps. But even so, it could have lots of artistic merit. It could allow people to communicate much more, sometimes for better, perhaps sometimes for worse too. Chapter 1, Talk, Listen, Watched. Everyone knowing everyone everywhere. Well, yes, that was that saying that was well known of the Integrated Universe program. But really, was it something that was really ever aspired to? Did everyone really want to have all the most intimate secrets shared with everyone? Certainly not. But to share more of ourselves more of the time could be a better thing still, depending on what we shared, how we shared, when, where, why, of course. All of those things mattered. In an ancient time, before this technology, before the ability to film each other and to live in live-streamed houses or towns or any of those things, before that people were dependent upon books, upon journals, magazines, newspapers, articles. Reading and writing, literacy, was a big thing for centuries as a way of communicating, messaging, contacting other people, to explain our stories, to explain the story of towns, of places, of people, of whole countries sometimes even, continents. People relied on stories and narratives to spread their information, to share knowledge with each other, for better or worse, though. And literacy in writing, for centuries and even millenniums, was a crucial way of contacting other people in distant places, places in other towns and cities and countries, and places that we'd have no hope of knowing anything about without that contact through books. Through books, magazines, newspapers, journals, through the written word, we learnt so many things through many centuries, although it had its limitations too, as all technologies do. Through the written word and the pictured words too. We could tell a story, read a story, hear about stories, discern about stories, mediate, think about stories too. Those stories could be translated from other languages, though it varied how much they could be, of course, depending on the translator's abilities and how many were available too. Nevertheless, through the written word and the spoken word too, we were able to capture different ideas, different stories, different things, historical events and facts that occurred to people. Things that did occur could be captured and recorded quite well as things that did not really occur, and fictional stories were born too, as well as the factual. Faction, fiction, all of them. Fictional facts, fictional fictions, and factual facts too, all of which were communicated through the written word and spoken word, and could be preserved through generations, through centuries, and sometimes through millennium, where translators allowed such things, that could be preserved to send a message to another continent, to another century, to a place in the future, or a place in a distant part of the country, or a distant part of the world. Through the written word, we were able to preserve messages, as also through the pictorial word. The pictures, as well as the writings, were able to give messages to people in distant places, to people in distant times too, those in the distant future, in decades ahead, centuries ahead perhaps, would be reading words, or listening to words, or mediating on words, or pictures even, from an ancient people, from a past, weeks ago, months ago, years or decades ago, or perhaps even in an ancient past, centuries earlier, or millenniums earlier, trying to decipher what those ancient pictures and what those stories had meant, and what relevance, if any, they could still perhaps have to a relevant situation of a similar type. The technological changes of the literacy word, of the written word and the pictorial word were gradual and slow, but with many sudden change developments over a long, vast period of time, of course. And one would expect all gradual technologies to have different changes, whether they're slow and gradual, shifting changes that take place over huge, great expanses of continents and people, or whether they're sudden developments with the sudden expansion or the sudden understanding of a new technology, or the sudden ability, or the sudden education of an ability that suddenly becomes more widespread, more overwhelmed, and more ubiquitous. That can transform and gradually change, or suddenly change, a people's attitude, ability, and their experiences in how they communicate, and in how they're able to communicate too. The old day, of course, theatre was a big way of communicating, perhaps the original way. Song and dance, and making sounds and movements, dances, drama, and lots of singing and songs, all combined together to make a theatrical performance that could tell its own story through dance and song and drama and movements and various actions. Though, of course, the theatre was always limited as well in its original designs, whatever the different types of arenas there were. Even the multi-tiered arenas that allowed for many more people to watch, standing in rows beyond each other, so that ever larger crowds could gather. So that some people weren't forced to listen far beyond or at a distance at the back and only hear the mumblings or see a very vague distant dot, small things so far away that could not be recognised easily. The theatre was limited in how many people were able to attend and how many were able to perceive or watch or to hear from that distance or within that area. The theatre, of course, couldn't easily travel. One had to travel and pilgrimage to the theatre itself. There, and try and get there early to get a good view, or else one might be at the back, hearing just the mumbling, or those actors that shouted loud enough to be heard, perhaps. Nevertheless, many children, dwarves, and smaller people were often allowed to the front, where it was overcrowded, so that they would have a chance of hearing and seeing properly. Though there were always the limitations of how many people could be sufficiently accommodated within such limiting technologies as the early theatres were. However much they tried to experiment and expanded their different styles and types and designs, and some were vast and allowed tens of thousands of people to be accommodated, to have some sort of view, however distant, to have some sort of hearing, however quiet it might be, and however hard it might be to hear, and distant to see. Nevertheless, tens of thousands sometimes packed out large volumes within the giant arenas, sometimes even larger ones that were born, that could have many showings per day, or many showings of days per year, and have many different styles, many different settings of different shapes and designs that accommodated all different types and numbers of people as well. However many different styles and shapes and designs over the decades and centuries that there were of these great theatres, to perform, to give a message, a story, to try and share something with others, still there were always those limitations. You could never really broadcast or perform something to a very larger number of people. Not that a book could do if it was copied out by many different people. Scribes over centuries copying the same or similar books would share stories that would travel, be carried by the merchants, and be travelling wanderers, spreading from land to land, from area to area, people to people. Perhaps through the theatre was able in its own way to travel, as books did, and songs and stories all did too. Well, perhaps technology itself is now able to travel and send us to different places without having to need to travel there. So now in a new age, without having to need to travel, messages can be sent to people in different parts of the world without people being summoned to one place to hear a story. With the advent of the telephone in the modern age, the 19th, 20th century, people were able to talk to others in far-flung, distant places, in completely different places, so far removed that it would have taken weeks, months, perhaps, to send a message in the past, for a messenger to travel such vast distances, and to be sure the message would be sent okay. One could never really be sure if the message was sent and received okay then. Then with the advent of the telephone, one was able to talk to people in distant places, but talk to them immediately, in the here and now, even though they were far removed, and that had transformed things. That then advanced, of course, and sending messages, sending videos became instant too. People were able to watch as well as listen to each other, to watch each other as well as talk to each other, immediately, albeit in different parts of the world, or different parts of the country, or the town, or the house, perhaps even different parts of the universe, ultimately, eventually. In different parts of the world we may be, but we may be watching each other, listening to each other, talking to each other, and responding to each other. Immediately we are sensing each other. We are able to adapt and see as much as we can of each other, to hear each other, talk to each other, to watch each other too, even though we're in completely different places, perhaps different parts of the world, perhaps just different parts of the same country or same region, or even just different parts of the same house.